Hi, and welcome to this episode of Inside the Music at MDC Music Studios, where we're featuring the SVT amp, legendary for a long time. Check this one out. So welcome to MDC Music Studios, where we've got a special guest today, Burret, who is going to be telling us a lot about the Ampeg, specifically all the lore and the legendary stories and what goes into making this amp as known as it is today. Dylan, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the studio. Tell us about the amp that we've got here behind us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So this is the Ampeg SVT. It's undeniably the most used bass amp of all time. I think every festival has a backline one of these. I've used them hundreds of times, and it's it's just like the bass amp. If there is one bass amp that the world would bring to a desert island, it would be this.
And when was it first launched?
I believe the official launch was in the summer of 1969 at the NAMM show, after they sent the prototypes out with the Rolling Stones to make sure that they worked, which is a great test.
Yeah, a little under pressure for sure.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I so many friends of mine who are bass players, and so many of them who use a specific amp. And we have this kind of little running joke about how big it is and how it's even sometimes used as a table. People just plop things on top, and everything from food to dinner to keys to the whole nine. It's like a coffee table, just that much higher.
Yeah, exactly. They're perceived as like just cement, indestructible pieces of equipment, but they have 16 vacuum tubes in there. There's a lot of things that can, I wouldn't put your meal on top of it.
But it's been known that, that amongst other stuff, drinks and beers and the whole nine,
of course.
Right? That's rock and roll, right?
Yeah.
So let's start off first, I guess, the inception of it and its roots, where it came from, basically the origin of the entire legend.
Totally. So in the late 60s, PA systems were severely underpowered for how popular rock music had become. Like the Beatles were playing, when they would play Shea Stadium, their vocals were the only thing coming through the PA, and that PA was just that little announcer speaker, like in the sort of like rotunda of the baseball stadium. It was like not enough, right? So the Beatles were getting outblown by the crowds, and there was this huge rush to like develop PA technology and also guitar and bass amps, right? So Marshall and Sun were developing amps in the late 60s that were 100 watts, but that still wasn't enough. So people started trying to develop something bigger with even more tubes. And Ampeg was one of those companies. They decided to try and develop the 300-watt amplifier. And the band that needed them the most was the Rolling Stones. So the Rolling Stones tour road manager had asked Ampeg, like, hey, we heard you're making this new supercharged high-powered amp, because amps were not being mic'd like they are today. They were expected to basically be the mains for the guitars and the bass at these festivals.
Crazy. Yeah.
Imagine being on stage and having to not worry about your own volume to hear yourself, but also the entire crowd hearing you.
Of course.
Right? So basically the road manager was like, hey, we heard you're doing this thing, can you get some ready for us? And I believe it was the Rolling Stones 1969 winter spring tour. They took out the very first prototypes. They got like 6 of them, and everyone in the band was using them, guitar and bass.
Wow.
So, because guitar and bass amps were not so clear cut, like this is a bass amp, this is a guitar amp. It was just like, is it loud?
Well, you had Fender, all the guitar players started using the Bassman.
The bass,
You had a whole bunch of, you're right, it was a time, I remember even Pete Townsend used to say, if the sound waves from your amp aren't keeping you standing up or without falling backwards, they're not loud enough, kind of a thing.
Exactly.
Right?
So the Rolling Stones used it. They told them what wasn't working and stuff, and they made some changes. And then summer '69 NAMM, the world became aware of the SVT.
Wow.
Yeah.
Crazy. And that's that period of time where the lights were usually on at shows and people were sitting down. It was such a different timing. And as amps, I guess, got louder and everything got louder, people felt the need to start to get up and dance along with things. And everything became much more of a concert, an environment, atmosphere, when you were definitely pushing the limits on the amps at the time, right?
Yeah, I think undeniably, because before, the loudest thing was always the drums. But when you develop an amp that is suddenly 3 times, the next loudest amp was 100 watts. This is 300 watts. Yeah. So much more. Then suddenly you're changing the landscape of the live music environment with something that different.
Yeah. So we heard a rumor. I think we heard a rumor about the inception of the 300 watts, and almost like what was coming out first and what was in the background, right?
Yeah. So there's a rumor that Pete Traynor up in Yorkville working with Long and McQuaid was already developing a 300 watt tube head. He hadn't quite gotten there yet, and that when Ampeg wanted to start looking at something, they kind of like, were snooping around up here to try and see if they get some ideas. This is not a confirmable thing, but this is the prevailing rumor, at least here in Toronto.
That's great. That's great.
Point of a little Canadian inspiration.
There's
perhaps.
our tie-in. There's the Canadian tie-in.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the people who brought this thing out. Once the Stones started to adopt it, there's other players. You would figure different styles of music that also wanted to incorporate this into their performances as well. Give us some of the names and I guess some of the other famous players who brought this to the legendary status that it's at today.
Yeah, so I believe Jack Cassidy was an early adopter, Jefferson Airplane, similar circles. Rod Stewart's band was using them. And outside of rock music, you get into like the fusion scene with like Tony Levin and Stanley Clarke and people. Wow. Because at a certain point, the amp is a very, very clean sounding amp. It was really about like, oh, I can get real loud now,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we're talking about this thing is, how much has it changed? Since its inception in '69 to today. I mean, different variations. Did they get it right off the bat? Any influence from other players that did any kind of modifications into it or anything at all?
Totally. There's been many different versions of the SVT, but the flagship, the modern version is called the SVT CL, and sort of the lineage of that original SVT to that SVT CL today. Once they got the tubes right, because 300 watts tube it's so temperamental, it's so tough to like sort of gauge all the power situations correctly. Once, the Rolling Stones had the prototypes and they blew up a bunch of them and said, here's what to fix. They've changed tubes a couple times, but other than that, the circuitry remains like pretty intact, at least in terms of the important stuff tonally. But they have tons of different models that have there's one with a graphic EQ and like one that you can, it's significantly quieter, but it's way lighter.
Yeah, of course.
There's variations, but the original is kind of the same this whole time.
And there's no mods you can really do to this. I imagine it's just being kept at the clean power that it's at, rather than doing any kind of mods to any of the capacitors, pots, anything.
Yeah, with this much, it's very easy to mess it up when you're getting into like this level of wattage, frankly. Changing the tubes is a great way to change the sound. You can use different kinds of tubes will get you like a much warmer sound or a much like sort of glassy or clean sound, and that alone has been a lot of the necessary changes that people feel to make to these things.
Great. Cool. Now, one of the cool things about this amp, cool in terms of your perspective about vintage gear, right? We got this proverbial hum going on over here, which is notorious with this amp and a lot of the old original vintage amps and stuff. But one of the things I was noticing when you were plugging in there is the frequency dial you've got on the Ampeg head, and how much of a change there is in between any of the settings over there. It's quite a bit of a jump.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess take us through to what it is that each of these settings are going to do for your sound.
Totally. So the mid-frequency knob is one of the only major changes they've made since the early 70s. It basically is changing with the mid-range boost or cut. It's changing what frequency you're boosting or cutting, which with the bass being sort of low mid-range instrument can be very powerful tonally at changing things. So I believe on number 1, so I'm just going to turn it up a bit to accentuate the differences.
Let's do it.
So on number 1, I believe we're boosting 220 hertz right now. So it's a little boxy, but then just to demonstrate the difference here, I'm going to go all the way to number 5, which now we're boosting 3 kilohertz. So a much more high mid situation. So to me, the difference I noticed there is when you're boosting 220, it's quite boxy and a little bit more woofy. And
Absolutely.
And so by not boosting that frequency and boosting a much higher mid frequency, you get a little bit more of that string attack. And yeah, so basically I like boosting frequencies. So a lot of people like cutting some of those lower mid frequencies. So you might go to, I believe 2 is 450 hertz, which will get you into a more of like a scooped modern sound. Right? But I much prefer just boosting the frequencies I do like. But it basically gives you a ton of tonal variation options that were not available with the original SVT.
And we got the high and the low buttons over here.
Yeah.
And what's the difference between them, and when are we using these guys?
So they are shelf EQs. So that's in super low frequencies are being boosted, and then super high frequencies are being boosted. I would normally I don't use them, but if I were to use them, it would definitely be in sort of like a heavier music situation. You know, maybe like a hard rock kind of situation. It gives you that actually automatically gives you that scooped like. Where you get that super low.
Right.
But also some of that ticky-tack high end that's going to let you poke through a mix.
And how much of the strings themselves are adding to this, right? Because what strings do you have on this?
So this is a vintage bass with flat wound strings. So round wound strings, which I have on this other bass here, would be significantly different sounding, which if we're talking about ultra high and ultra low, I might, switch to that instrument.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so we've swapped basses here now. Now, what I want to ask you is, what kind of a travel do you do between swapping basses, and how much of a change you got to do on the actual amp? Because some basses obviously going to be more highlighted with, more high end, depending on the pickups and all that kind of stuff. So going between, you obviously came from a P bass, now you're on a 5-string over here.
Yeah.
And, what's the adjustment you make with this?
Totally. So that one has flat wounds, which are a much mellower sound, like the Motown vibes, and this one has round wounds, which is like the modern rock sound, more common. So I would probably turn on these ultra high and ultra low knobs. First of all, I'd get rid of a little bit more treble, because basically what's happening is this high switch is also treble, but it's a different frequency of treble. So what you're doing is you're cutting one and boosting another, so you're getting this like interesting wave, right? So right off the bat, I'd probably go here for the mids, cut a tiny bit, boost a bit of bass, and you end up with something more like.
Definitely a lot more bite to that, for
sure. A lot more bite, and then because it's got so much more bite, you got to put back some of the real low.
Overcompensate for that.
A little bit, yeah.
Wow.
So you get that sort of like glassy modern vibe pretty easily. But again, I'm not really changing a whole lot. I, press a couple buttons.
What are we at now without the buttons now?
Without the buttons. Just a lot more mid.
Right, absolutely.
The high and low are really giving you the smiley face, scooped situation.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Another question for you here now. I mean, a lot of guitar players are forgoing amps live. Yeah. They're going direct into things like quad cortex or helixes and stuff like that. But yet, this is still a staple and mainstay anywhere you go. And how is it that bass players are traditionally staying more with amps? I know they go DI live in certain situations and stuff like that, but this is still a penchant for people to go run to, because you know what you're getting with this, right? But this is still, I'm more finding that the guitar players are trying to take the easy, more convenient package of whatever it is, and everything's sitting within one box, right? And now you got a pedal board, which is great.
Yeah.
But how much, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, is this here to stay? Is this something that does not have almost like the cemetery sign on it, it'll be gone in a little while or anything like that?
I think they are, and I think the reason is that low end is a very, very finicky thing. The low frequencies, they're so much longer, and they're so much harder to recreate, both in your in-ears, with wedges.
Right.
And it's a lot harder to feel things on stage. Like if you have guitars coming through a wedge monitor, or maybe just in your ears, there's not a lot of low information. But it's very hard to recreate those things accurately in those different monitoring situations. But mainly, I think it's because people want to feel the music.
Right.
And you're always going to feel the drums.
That you will.
You know? And so I think this is here to stay. because people want to feel the music. And the way that you feel the music a lot of the time is the bass and the drums.
Yeah, it's such a dynamic that even on stage you can't replicate unless you have that feel, that vibe that you're getting with everything. That you're right, that low rumble, the stage shaking kind of a thing, right?
Yeah,
So.
and even like as in a, things happen. Monitors break. Your monitors fall out of your ears. And so I play with a lot of artists who want me to have an amp on stage simply for the fact that if something goes wrong, they're always going to hear the drums, and they're always going to hear me.
Of course.
Wow.
Very cool, very cool. A question I have, I mean, I myself, I always tinker with guitars and change them, I modify them, I do a lot of things that I think could be improvements on the instrument. Not necessarily on the instrument as a whole, but specific things that I'm looking for, that I would be functional for me, so to speak, right? What about the amp for you? Like any ideas or things that you think that you would like to see done? I know they haven't changed much since its inception, as you said, but anything that you think would definitely improve, or things that you would change to fit your needs or what you're looking for in terms of sound?
Absolutely. So there's two main things. The first thing, which I've looked into heavily, is a way to make it a little bit quieter. Because these amps are so loud, and sometimes with bass, you want to get some of that, like, that tube warmth, that tube drive. But in order to achieve that with these amplifiers, you have to turn it up so loud that almost no one's going to be okay with it.
Yeah.
Except other bass players.
That's the old Marshall thing. Marshalls, as they say, are only, that's the sweet spot is when you crank them up, you get that thing, right?
Right, and so they have, for guitar amps, they have those attenuators. So you
Power
can,
breaks and
power
stuff like
soaks,
that.
things like
Yeah.
that. But because of how many watts are in this thing, there isn't really a product available. But I feel like Ampeg could maybe introduce like a switch or something to sort of power it down a bit, so that we can achieve those gritty tube tones without absolutely destroying people's ears.
It's a great idea. I'm almost wondering if you can just find someone to source out to do that yourself, right?
Yeah, I've looked into it.
Yeah,
It would be very expensive.
Yeah, I'm sure.
As an
sure.
aftermarket thing, for
Absolutely.
sure.
And what's your other point that you were saying?
So the other point is, we're in the time of modern home recording technology, right? If you're an up-and-coming musician, you probably have a DAW, and you probably use the EQ. So people, I think, these days are vastly more aware of EQ points, right? Numbers, what they mean.
Right.
Oh, you got to cut the 500. You want a high shelf. People understand this terminology way better than they did in the 70s, because it's so easy to see it visually these days. And I think having that information more easily accessible, because I just had to Google what those midpoints are on that mid-frequency knob,
There
right?
you are. Yeah.
And it wasn't even in the manual. I had to go to a forum where someone was like, it used to be in the manual.
Yeah.
I want that information on the amp somewhere.
Wow. That is cool. That would be a good idea.
Yeah.
And getting back to, I guess the introduction of it and how they haven't changed much of it, right? The amp was obviously from the States, right?
Yeah.
And so many things were being done at that time from British manufacturers that were putting, obviously, like the high watts or the Marshalls and stuff like that. So grabbing this big out of nowhere thing from the States and everyone, what was the acceptance like, and what was the reaction to this when it first came out?
I think it was pretty universal, like acclaim. Like it was, because it was another few years before wedge monitors for people to use to hear themselves was even invented. So I think it was like amazing. We'll be able to hear, the audience will be able to hear my bass. Like that's a pretty big step up.
Right.
Imagine the first time someone had a microphone and a speaker at a concert.
Absolutely.
So many more people will hear my expression.
But it was also the cabinet, right? I mean, the cabinet over here, like we got a 421 and a 112 on the cabinet right now, and it looks like it's been through a war, which it seems like I think it has actually been through a war.
Yeah.
But this was also part of the entire package. It wasn't simply just the head. I mean, the head is obviously notoriously, it hasn't changed much at all. But in terms of the cabinets, we've got the giant one over here. What's in our cabinet over here?
The Ampeg 8x10, which is kind of the, it's got a ubiquitous nickname, the fridge, because it's as big as a fridge.
It is.
I don't know how they came to the idea of 8 10-inch speakers in a cabinet, but I think it is the ultimate cabinet. Almost as important as the amplifier itself to the sound, because when you talk about surface area per speaker, people think of 15s. Oh, it's a bigger speaker, more low frequencies. But it's also about the total surface area of speaker conage, right? Which you get way more with an 8x10 than with 2x15.
And that's actually where we have the mics placed down here. So you're getting more definitely the low end out of the out of the woofer there.
Yeah.
Right, but that we also have in the studio. We have another Ampeg, a smaller cabinet over here, and how much is it basically being kept to the vintage requirements? People wanting to use the original cabinets with the head, or is it something that they will mix and match, like a vintage head with more of a newer cabinet?
I think they're pretty interchangeable. The main differences with the vintage cabinets is that they had no ports. Right, so there was no air escaping.
Right.
And they also had no wheels and no handle. So I think people are leaning to the modern ones for that point alone. I tried transporting one that didn't have the wheels once.
You need some good friends.
There's no handle. Like, it's just a big piece of wood.
It is, yeah.
You know?
Not fun. Definitely not fun.
And I think the speakers might have changed along the way as well. But I've never heard anyone complain about the modern speakers.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and as you said, they are mainstays on stage, right? And in backline, anywhere, any festival you go, you're always going to see that, right?
Yeah, it's like if I don't see an SVT on the backline, I kind of am like suspicious.
Then many things will probably go wrong as well.
Yeah,
right?
who knows?
Cool, cool, cool. One of the things that I've always, to myself anyway, compared Ampegs to stuff like High Watts, which are really good, clean amps with a great platform to be able to have effects and add things that are complementary to how powerful and clean it is already. Now, obviously, it doesn't come with any onboard things whatsoever, but you obviously brought a pedal board and are keeping true to that thought that it's a great platform to be able to add pedals to, right?
Yeah, so I was saying earlier that I wish they made a bit of a quieter version so that you could get some of that tube grit. But the great thing about the SVT is you don't really need it because it's such a great pedal platform that you can just add, you know, certain amps get affected, if that makes sense, more by effects than others.
You're right.
So the amp really takes, like, if you turn on some drive, like, that almost is more of the SVT sound to me than just the super clean, you know, if you add a fuzz. You know, like, it really takes all the best parts of the sound of a pedal you're adding to your signal and really gives it life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you also have the HX Stomp there. We actually did a feature on that. It's almost like the advent of being able to, you know, come in with DI'd, direct sounds that you're already, you know, you've got that you've worked on and are part of the songs that you've already crafted and stuff like that. Using this with the amp, you're actually using something that we've covered as a direct line, but now using it live with this amp.
Yeah.
How do you find that interacts with the Ampeg with that?
It's great. It's funny, the HX Stomp, whenever I don't have an SVT, I'm simply emulating an SVT with a 421. You know, that's like one of the main reasons it's always on my board is because I like the sound, because the sound of a bass going into an amplifier and then going through a monitor, through a speaker, and then through a microphone is extremely different than DI. So I always am emulating an SVT with the HX Stomp, but I use it for a ton of different things. Like I have these like synthesizer-based effects that really, this might be really loud, I don't know. Where it's almost like a Moog.
Right.
Or like a really intense, like low-end synthesizer. But it still feels like a bass, which is wonderful because I'm going through this signal chain.
Of course.
So I can emulate synthesizers and keyboards and guitar parts, and I can do octave up things, but it all filters back through the ubiquitous sound of the SVT that ends up with, like, it's a perfect pedal platform, and it keeps my brain in the sense of being a bass player, and it doesn't sound completely different to me, even though I'm using completely different sounds.
We've never done a direct out of an SVT, do we?
I don't know. Some of them have the DI out, but I think the speaker is where a lot of the magic is.
No, without a doubt, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so Dylan, we've swapped basses once again, and I'm intrigued by the actual guitar that you got here, because it's the fanned fretboard here.
Yeah.
But in the attempt of showing the diversity of what the amp can do and how many different styles it can move across and be able to live comfortably, so to speak, you know, what are we basically plugging into and moving into style-wise here?
So I've got a Dingwall bass which has significantly longer strings and brighter strings. So it's going to give you a lot more low end and a lot more high end at the same time. and I'm gonna use a pick. I'm gonna play really hard, and I've turned the amp down a lot, but it's not gonna sound like that. But this is the versatility of the SVT, is that it can take anything, right? So you get into like a modern metal sound almost with like a... You get into like fuzzes and stuff even, like the... Like no other amp in the world is gonna do that.
Yeah, you're right. It's funny because it does take a beating, and we've had, specifically in the studio, other bass players to come in, and as soon as they see the thing, they're like, oh yeah, they already know what they're getting into. We call it like the old comfortable shoe, I guess, if you will, right?
Yeah.
But what are the competitors to this? And what's the I guess the closest competitor to something like this, or the option, the alternative to the SVT?
Yeah, so pretty much every major amp company these days has you have your tiny digital amp that you can put in your gig bag, and you have your medium-sized amp that you can, so every company has kind of everything now, but everybody, they got their version of the SVT, but I don't know if it compares, so Trainer has the YBA 300, which is very similar, with a few differences, and I believe Aguilar has, I'm not sure what the model's called, but they have, their version of the SVT. But there's just something about the preamps and the specific tubes in the Ampeg, because they'll all get loud. Everybody can be loud now. That's no longer the issue. The difference is the way that it receives the variety of basses, and the way that the EQ points will affect your tone in a way that just ends up working every time.
So I know you do a lot of production as well, right? Now, UAD's notoriously had their Ampeg SVT, the actual plug-in to that. How would you compare the plug-in version of some of the, it's not just UAD, we've got quite a few other companies that also offer variations on it, but how would you compare the plug-in world in terms of recording with actually the real-life version and miking it up? What's our travels between each, preferences between the plug-in versus the real thing?
I think there's two main differences, and the first one, again, is the low end. I don't know if they've figured out the low end, modeling the low end in the digital world yet. There's just something a little bit different about it. Like if you had a model of this cab with the 421 with this head, and you switch between them, like you A-B them, I think where you're gonna notice, if it's on a clean sound, is the low end. And then the other thing is how they break up, right? Because this thing, notoriously, as I was saying, in order to make it break up, you have to turn it up incredibly loud.
Yeah.
But the way that, something about when you start to feel that tube grit doesn't hit quite the same as when you do it with a real one. But if you're just going for a clean sound and you're not going down to these crazy low notes all the time, they're great. They're great for what they are. Like, this is a very cumbersome device to deal with physically.
And you need some friends.
And you need some friends. you need a place where you can be extremely loud.
Yeah.
So I love that technology, right? Like, I live in an apartment. I use that stuff all the time.
Of course. So let's get you to play something a little bit more on the Dingwall here, kind of show us some more of the sounds and flexibility on this specific setting.
Yeah, totally. So from a super clean perspective, we got like...
And that's it, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to Inside the Music at MDC Music Studios and having Dylan Burret. Thank you so much for coming in, Dylan. Make sure you press subscribe, like the videos, and hit that little bell at the top to make sure that we're all up to date and anything that comes out from MDC Music Studios goes directly into your notifications. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.